Hey guys, so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit today about what my first code was like. Now, I actually got really lucky. Every code is very different, but I would have to say the very first code I ever went to was one of the most well-run codes I have ever been to. The intensivist was very attentive, checking with every single person in each role to make sure they were okay, making sure compressors didn't need to switch sooner, making sure whoever was helping ventilate the patient was not getting, cramps in their arms, or they didn't need to switch or didn't need assistance with suctioning, anything of the sort, as well as making sure, nurses pushing the medication were doing okay. It was just phenomenal. That was a very well-run code. So I think that being in a code is something that every student, no matter what medical field you're going into, is either super excited to be a part of, not because, they want someone to be in that situation, but they want to be able to use the skills that they've learned and learn how to treat patients in a highly critical situation, or they're terrified for the same exact reason. They're either worried they don't know enough, or they're worried because they don't know how they will react. And it's really hard to predict how you're going to react until you're in that situation. Something interesting with a code, either a sudden cardiac arrest, or if you're responding to a trauma of some sort, is that it's very organized chaos. Everyone has their roles, and you'll learn this in your BLS and ACLS classes if you haven't already taken them. There's going to be someone recording events and taking, the time down to see when the next medication needs to be administered, or when whoever is doing chest compressions needs to switch out, because let me tell you what, if you think about it, it's a really, really high intensity activity. You're having to push 120 plus times per minute, at least 1/3 of the depth of the chest, and that takes a lot of energy as well as physical strength, and you already have a lot of adrenaline pumping through your body in that situation because you know that it's a critical situation, that 2 minutes can seem like an eternity. So like I said, my very first code, I was a bit nervous to be in my first code just because I didn't know what to expect exactly. We had done our BLS and ACLS classes, and I had seen everything I've seen on TV. I had heard stories from my upperclassmen as well as family members in the medical field, and I just knew that there were so many things that could be going on. I was a little nervous because I didn't know what to expect. So the first code that I experienced was actually not my patient that day, but they were on the same floor as our patient load. It was within my very first clinical rotation, and also very quickly in my very first clinical rotation. So of course, even though the patient was not on our list, anytime there was a code blue called, if you're in the area, especially as a respiratory therapist, and you're not doing something that is also emergent, if you can go to that code to check, make sure that everybody is there that needs to be there. There is a respiratory therapist available and in the room. And especially if you're a student, more often than not, they will have you go to codes for those experiences, because even though you never wish for anyone to code or to go into sudden cardiac arrest, it is a good learning experience for a student to see how the team functions as a whole, and to see these things while you're a student, rather than having never experienced a code on your clinical rotations and then getting out as a new grad and that being your very first code experience. And that's kind of my philosophy with a lot of things. If I could experience something as a student, that's when I wanted to do it. That's when I wanted to try. I wanted to, experience something or do something for the first time with someone that had been a respiratory therapist for, however many years, whoever my preceptor was that day, next to me in case I needed something. When we arrived to the room was just packed because everyone shows up. And the reason they do that is because you never know what someone else is doing. So like I said, even though it's not our patient, my preceptor and I showed up to make sure that, the respiratory therapist that did have that patient was there to see if they needed help, if there was anything else we could do. By the time I had arrived, the patient was already intubated, and the RT on that floor was actually ventilating the patient, but they did need people to do compressions, because you always want to have a minimum of 2, if not more, depending on how long a code is, to be able to switch people out, because you want to make sure you're doing effective compressions. And if you get tired or cannot do the compressions deep enough, there's nothing wrong with switching with someone else. There's no shame in it, and it is something that you have to get used to over time, because if your compressions are not effective, the resuscitation is not effective, and that is the whole point of everything you're doing. So if someone gives you constructive criticism, or asks if you're getting tired and you need to switch, don't be prideful. If you are tired, switch, because it's not about you, it's about the patient that you are resuscitating. The first time doing compressions, I was very concerned if I was doing them correctly, because that's all I kept thinking about was, I need to be doing this correctly for the patient. So I do remember, double checking, because you can ask people around you. It's perfectly okay, especially if it's your first time, am I compressing deep enough? Because at that angle, sometimes it can be difficult to tell, or if it is your first time doing compressions, you have a lot of adrenaline going. And it's kind of funny, because I was also worried about perhaps being too emotional in the code, or my very first code, because I hadn't experienced that yet. I didn't know how I was going to react, and I was fully aware of, even though I knew that I had been trained, you can't predict your reaction in a situation like that most of the time, especially if you've never done it before. So although I was worried about making sure I was doing compressions adequately, I kind of got into a zone and was looking at everything clinically. I was, looking to see if the patient needed to be suctioned out of the corner of my eye. I was kind of looking to see what was going on in the room while focusing on doing compressions. And I think that is one of the biggest things about handling a code situation, is making sure you're looking at everything objectively. And I think that's what a lot of people do. And I didn't realize that I would look at it so objectively and from a medical standpoint until I was in there, because I was very worried. What if I get emotional? What if, this happens or that happens? Every code is different, and I have been a part of codes where everyone leaves the room in tears. You're going to have different experiences for each one, but I was worried I would get emotional and perhaps, give the family the wrong impression, something of that sort. I knew I needed to be focused, and thankfully that's what I was able to do on my very first code, because that was one of my biggest fears, is that there would be family in the room and I would get emotional and maybe, get upset or something going on, and I wanted to be there and be strong for the family. In that code, I was in full PPE, or personal protective equipment, due to not only there being some contact precaution issues, but as well as, codes are not always clean. The majority of the time they are not. They are not these perfect, pristine situations that you see in most television series. Unfortunately, the patient did not make it. They ended up passing. And I was lucky enough, I actually had a really good preceptor that day, and he had asked me, I honestly don't remember if he asked me before the code or after, if that was the first time I had been in a code, or if maybe I mentioned it, but I know that he was aware that that was my first code. So after the room, was cleared out and we were leaving, of course, we still had things we had to do. And in most situations, you have to walk away from a code and go to your next patient room and continue with your day. So he was actually really great and stopped and asked me, hey, do you need a second? Do you want to talk about anything? Was there anything you didn't understand that was happening? Like, what can I do for you? And I was really thankful for that, because I have heard of situations where people have had their first code and then were immediately rushed off to do something else, and they didn't feel prepared to move on from that scenario yet. It is something that you have to figure out how to deal with, and whether that's taking a minute and taking a deep breath, running to the restroom really quick, wash your hands, and just recomposing yourself. It is something that is unfortunately very common in healthcare. Some teams do what's called a debriefing, where they talk about what happened, what could have caused the code itself, as well as it gives all of the team members a minute to kind of voice any concerns they had, or if they're, feeling upset by something. It gives them that second to kind of speak out and have that support of the group there. All codes are sad and upsetting, and if you look at statistics, unfortunately, more often than not, when someone goes through that code procedure, they do not make it. It's a very small percentage of patients that do make it, and then many of them end up having some type of deficiency afterwards due to lack of oxygen to the brain and tissues. But I will say, as far as that being my first code, I was very lucky again to have a supportive preceptor and a supportive team and a fantastic intensivist running the code itself. So I actually had a very good first experience. No, codes are not a good experience in general, don't get me wrong. But as far as, seeing the way a code should be run, seeing a team work together effectively, these were all things that were really important. And if you do experience your first code and you feel upset by something, or you need a minute to collect yourself, and someone wants to just run to the next room, maybe they don't know it was your first code, or they are concerned with their work, you can, politely ask them, hey, can I just have a second to collect myself? Whether that's running to the restroom and just taking a second to breathe and getting out of the noise, because codes can be very noisy and it seems chaotic, but it's very organized chaos. There's just a lot happening at once. So it's kind of like a sensory overload almost. The noise, all the talking, the movement, role changes, things of that sort. So sometimes you just need a second to kind of reset yourself, and that's perfectly fine. There are codes that all of us need to do that, and sometimes people are able to just, pick up and go to the next room or go about what they were doing depending on what's going on. It's definitely something that comes along with time that you learn to handle, and how you personally need to adjust and handle those situations. But basically it was just a very short kind of description of what my first code was like. I can't give you a lot of details, of course, because we don't want to break HIPAA or worry about anything of that sort. But if you guys have any questions or want to share any experiences or tips that you have down below, feel free to, and I will see you guys next time.